Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we delve into China's growing nuclear ambitions, where it could lead in the future, what it means for the world, and how it's different from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Joining us today, we have Patty Jane Geller, policy analyst of nuclear deterrence and missile defense at the Heritage Foundation, and Rick Fisher, senior fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center. Let's delve in. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you for having me on.
So there seems to be a kind of shift in policy where a lot of countries are not really listening to America's nuclear deterrence anymore. For example, China is starting to build up its own nuclear arsenal. Why do you think that is?
Well, there are some who assert that China is now rapidly building up its nuclear arsenal in response to the United States, which over the last decade has left treaties about missile defense and theater nuclear weapons. But this is false. This is a canard. China is building up its nuclear forces after decades. It is jumping from an estimated level of about 300 to 400 warheads to a level approaching 3,500 warheads. That's what it will be doing. So China wants global nuclear superiority because it wants to achieve global political and economic and military hegemony on Earth. It wants to be the Chinese Communist Party wants to be the most powerful force on Earth so that it can set the rules, so that it can control your economic future, your political future, your security, not just in China, but the whole world.
China is conducting what Admiral Richard, our head nuclear weapons chief in the U.S., has called a breathtaking expansion of its nuclear weapons arsenal. We're seeing, in the last month, we found 2 discoveries of China building over 100 silos each in its western desert that could host more nuclear long-range missiles. Since China got its own nuclear weapons back in the 1960s, it has maintained pretty much the least number of nuclear weapons that it needed just to deter a nuclear attack. But I think what we see China doing is expanding its nuclear arsenal beyond that minimum deterrence posture and becoming more like a peer nuclear competitor to the United States.
And it seems one of the main ways of combating that is stockpiling your own nuclear arsenal. But what are some other ways of de-escalation?
I'm glad that you mentioned this because it's important to remember that brute force and having a strong defense is critical, but it's not the only thing. The reason it's critical is because it enables us to use other tools like diplomacy. If we have a strong nuclear force, it's easier for our diplomats to go engage, knowing that we have the backing of a strong defense. And so I think that's part of the reason we need to make sure we have strong forces, because we want to be able to solve crises with tools like diplomacy or economic sanctions, not actually using force. So I think I always emphasize when I write and speak that we need to be modernizing our own nuclear force and at the same time pursuing diplomacy with China to try to get them to come and negotiate and discuss its ambitions, its intentions, and its nuclear forces, and to try to find some sort of agreement that can help improve stability. Well,
the most common method of de-escalating nuclear threats is to sit down at a table and talk about it. This is what the United States and the former Soviet Union managed to do after about 15 years of nuclear competition. By the mid-1960s, both sides had started a process that led to successive nuclear reduction agreements. Both sides realized that building thousands of nuclear weapons wasn't advancing their interests. It wasn't making them more secure, nor was it allowing the Soviet Union to become the global hegemon. So the Soviets decided, okay, we'll try to compete in other areas. Well, they couldn't, and eventually the Soviet Communist Party collapsed. in about 1990. But before that, the United States and the Soviet Union had a process, and that produced a very welcome stability, welcome in both countries and welcome all around the world, except in China, because the Chinese Communist Party, in my opinion, has never deviated from a goal of global domination. And it just delayed its achievement of that domination until it could accumulate the economic power and the political power to allow its military to become the dominant one on the globe. So I don't think that China is going to be in any mood to engage in nuclear reduction talks first until it's superior, and then it won't engage in limitation negotiations. It will be issuing orders. It will be telling all the other nuclear armed powers how many they can have and how much they should reduce. And it will be constraining freedom around the world, because it will be imposing on all countries, okay, you have to buy Huawei, you have to buy ZTE, because we want to monitor everything you say, everything you think. That's the future that the Chinese Communist Party wants to impose on the rest of us. And in order to do so, it is now sprinting, rapidly building toward a level of nuclear power that is the greatest on Earth.
We do have the New START treaty with Russia, but how likely are we to get Beijing also onto a negotiating table?
It's going to be difficult, but I think it is a worthwhile initiative. Beijing has complained time after time that it shouldn't be negotiating an arms control agreement with the United States and Russia because it has a lot fewer nuclear weapons than we do. Currently, New START constrains the U.S. and Russia to deploying about 1,500 nuclear weapons. Current estimates show that China only has about 200 to 300 nuclear weapons. So their argument has been, we don't have as many as you do, Russia and the United States, so you all should continue reducing your nuclear stockpiles, and then China will continue building up its own, as we see that it's doing. So I think that, combined with China's history of maintaining lack of transparency over its nuclear arsenal and its intentions, will make it very difficult to compel China to the negotiating table. I think that doesn't mean we shouldn't try for the effort, though, because President Trump especially has made a great effort and starting to say that China is on its way to becoming a peer competitor. We shouldn't wait to start talking about arms control until it does have the same number of weapons as the U.S. and Russia do.
Well, in order to get the attention of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, we're going to have the ability to threaten everything they value. That does not necessarily mean we will use that level of power, but just like in the 1960s, when the Soviets and the Americans built up to levels well in excess of 5,000 warheads before deciding to sit down and negotiate toward lower numbers, I think we're looking at a period with China where we're going to have to build up to very large numbers before the Chinese realize that the optimal choice is to build down. Now, the real problem here is that China will link any nuclear weapons reductions to political goals, such as it will say, okay, you want arms control? Stop supporting Taiwan. Destroy your military alliances that preserve freedom in Japan and South Korea, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia. Go home, America. Basically, they want to use their nuclear power to impose defeats on the democracies, to make them weaker so that they capitulate and succumb to Chinese Communist Party hegemony. Frankly, there's really nothing that you can do to talk them out of it. All that you can do is build up to numbers sufficient, along with other capabilities, perhaps like missile defense, which cancel their offensive missiles, or at least a portion of them, which all will add up someday in the future, we hope, to demonstrating to the Chinese Communist Party leadership that such a sprint to nuclear superiority is futile.
So under the New START treaty that the U.S. has with Russia, each country is limited to around 1,500 warheads. But for instance, if the U.S. were to break that to deal with China's growing threat, what would Russia do?
Well, the Russians are already exceeding their limits. They're producing new weapons like nuclear-powered torpedoes that can cross oceans to attack big cities and coastal regions. The real question is, when will the United States start to prepare for the same? That will require the United States to get out of the New START treaty. The Biden administration, however, made a big deal about extending the New START treaty for another 5 years. It's not sure what they hope to accomplish. It's not sure they did this with any real serious analysis of what the Chinese might do. Well, I think that probably helped contribute to the Chinese decision to begin building all of these silos when the Biden administration told the Russians, okay, we're not going to build any more nuclear weapons for another 5 years. That was probably tantamount to a starting gun for the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party to start building up their nuclear weapons.
What's going on right now in the U.S. is that we're having a debate over replacing our old nuclear weapons. We call it nuclear modernization. So all of our current forces right now, our warheads and our delivery systems like our missiles and our submarines were built during the Cold War. Our ICBMs were designed in the 1960s, before the internet even existed. So they're really old. So what we're trying to do right now is just replace those systems with ones built in the 21st century, which is kind of something simple we really ought to get done, because the older that our weapons get, the less likely that they are to work as intended. But unfortunately, we're having to debate even replacing those old weapons in the first place. There's a camp out there that argues that we shouldn't replace our old missiles. For instance, we should just let them continue age out so that we don't have them anymore. So I think personally we should be having the debate of how we can adjust our nuclear force posture to adjust to what China's doing.
So why is our arsenal right now currently not strong enough to deter?
So I wouldn't argue that our current arsenal is not strong enough to deter right now. It's where we're going if we don't replace our systems. The problem is what will happen in 5 to 10 years. As one example, our ICBMs, our long-range nuclear missiles, are set to start retiring by the end of the decade, and they're so old, they're over 50 years old, that if it would be very difficult for us to keep those running any longer than the end of the decade. So if we don't develop our replacement capability for those missiles in time, then that's where we will have big problems, because we're going to have to start retiring those missiles below the current levels we have today, or keep them in and have old technology that might not be credible enough to deter nuclear threat. That's what we want to avoid by making sure we have a strong, modernized nuclear force before this starts to happen.
So from a military, political, economic, and technical standpoint, how close is China now to competing with the U.S.?
They're very close, and they have been very canny and strategic in the way in which they've developed their capabilities and hidden their capabilities. They have hidden their intentions. They have practiced brilliant deception, lying essentially, and we have now reached a period where it's almost too late. China not just is working for hegemony on Earth, they're working to achieve hegemony over the Earth-Moon system. They want to be the dominant power on the moon and on Mars. And they're developing the capabilities to get there and to get there economically, just as the United States is doing. Unfortunately, the United States has yet to wake up to the full extent of the ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Biden administration is not doing a very good job explaining this threat to the American people. We need to be investing in missile defense. We need to be investing in civil defense for our people in the event China and Russia decide to strike us. They've been cooperating in missile defense for the last decade. If they're cooperating in missile defense, then that suggests to me they've already considered cooperation in missile offense. So we're in a very dangerous period. The United States needs to wake up. We need our leaders to pay attention to this threat, and we need them to act.
So say China succeeds in creating such a threat. Do we have something that could defend against that kind of a bomb?
Good question. I'm glad you bring up missile defense. That's a big issue as well. So currently, no. The United States does have about 44 interceptors based on the U.S. homeland. They can be launched when we have warning of an incoming nuclear missile, and then we can intercept the nuclear bomb or the nuclear warhead before it detonates on U.S. soil. But those current 44 interceptors are really only designed to intercept very small or limited threats from a state like North Korea, or maybe an accidental launch from Russia or China. They're not meant to defend against China's nuclear forces right now. That being said, the United States is developing advanced missile defenses in the Indo-Pacific region. So I've been advocating for advanced missile defense system on Guam. So that's one thing that I think the United States can do is deploy more missile defenses to Guam, so that if China tries to start a conflict, not necessarily against our contiguous U.S. homeland, but in the Indo-Pacific, we have the missile defenses there to stop it.
The United States has less than 100 missile interceptors. The number of missile interceptors is designed to cancel a nuclear threat from North Korea. It is not designed at all to defeat ICBM attack from Russia or China. The United States would have to adopt a new policy and would probably end up having to deploy thousands of missile interceptors in order to have at least a limited capability of defeating a portion of the nuclear attack that could come from China or Russia. And at some point, it simply becomes too expensive to rely on missile defenses primarily. We also have to have enough offensive weapons to make sure that the Chinese Communist leadership knows that everything they value will be destroyed if they use their nuclear weapons against us.
What would be the best course of action, not just for the U.S., but also the international community? Well,
first and foremost, the United States needs to replace its multiple warhead capacities. With the 2010 New START treaty negotiated by the Obama administration, we agreed to cut down our warheads to the current levels. When we replace our current missiles with all the multiple warheads that they can carry, that will take our level up to about 3,200, which is close to where I believe the Chinese are initially aiming to achieve. So the Russians would probably have about 4,000, maybe more, the Chinese 3,500, and we would have to build some more missiles to rise to a level of about 3,500. But the United States, in order to deter Chinese attack, would have to also invest heavily in missile defense. And this process will just continue until the Chinese give up, until the Chinese Communist Party decides that it cannot achieve global hegemony. Now, I would hope that India would also begin to seriously build up its nuclear forces. The Russian or the French and the British, which have about 200 to 300 warheads today, they both need to build up to a total combined level of about 1,000 warheads. That would be my advice to them. And then our allies like Japan, South Korea, partners like Taiwan, they have difficult choices to make. If they decide they require a nuclear deterrent to prevent a Chinese attack, my hope is that the United States would support their ambition, both politically and with technology. Look, China has made Pakistan, North Korea, and Iran into nuclear missile states. This is a travesty. We haven't even sanctioned China for all of its aid to North Korea's nuclear missile capabilities. And I believe this is a travesty. It's a demonstration of weakness.
What do you think are some ways, like the average American, can learn more about this threat and try and help?
Nuclear deterrence, we don't talk about it as much as we did during the Cold War, but the situation has changed. Russia and China are developing their nuclear forces, and the United States needs to make sure it has its own modern and strong forces as well.
We should always remember, the Chinese Communist Party has already massacred 70 million people, 70 million Chinese. So I really don't think that they have that much more regard for the rest of us. If China achieves global hegemony, I think we already have the answers about what to expect. Death and more death.
We saw in the last month 2 discoveries of China building 100 new missiles each in 2 different sites. And we didn't predict those. And I should mention that I think just a few days ago, we also discovered China building a new tunnel at its nuclear weapons testing site, which could indicate that China is advancing its nuclear testing capabilities as well. And I think this tells us 2 things. One, that we don't know what else China is doing. In what other ways are they advancing or growing our arsenal that we don't know about publicly yet? And 2, I think it tells us that China has a capacity to make quick changes to its nuclear arsenal. And my hope is that the more public that this news becomes, the more that the United States and those members of Congress and those on both sides of the aisles will kind of give more importance or alarm to the need to make sure our own forces are modern and strong and resilient ourselves.
There is a great deal of analysis from private organizations, and every year the Pentagon publishes a report mandated by the Congress on developments in China's military capabilities. The reports are easy to read. If you begin reading them, read back. We have about 20 years of these reports now, and it's worth reading them to get a sense of the history of China's military buildup. And then you have to decide: are your leaders defending the country to the degree that you want it to be defended? If not, then engage in our democratic process. But because we're a democracy, our process depends on citizens making themselves informed, seeking information, and making decisions. If you refuse to do that, if you decide not to care, then you're giving the advantage to the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode with guests Patty Jane Geller, Policy Analyst of Nuclear Deterrence and Missile Defense at the Heritage Foundation, and Rick Fisher, Senior Fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.